another episode of Data for Future. I'm your host, Tammy Liang. Today, we're diving into the second most abundant greenhouse gas after carbon dioxide, methane. Methane makes about 16% of global emissions, and it has a disproportionately large impact on climate change, making it a critical target for mitigation efforts. In this episode, we'll explore global methane emissions with a focus on one of the major contributors, which is enteric methane, or as it's commonly known as cow burps. We'll also discuss the current solutions and challenges in the methane mitigation space. With that being said, I'm excited to have Barrett Olafson, Project Manager for Enteric Methane Mitigation Program at Spark Climate Solutions, to join us and share his expertise. And for those of our audience considering a career transition into climate work, Barrett will also offer valuable insights from his own journey into climate field. Welcome, Barrett.
Hi, Tammy. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak a little bit about methane and share my climate transition journey.
Awesome. To kick it off, Barrett, why don't you give us a global introduction of methane? Why is it important, or why is it a big problem?
Sure. Methane accounts for 16% of global greenhouse gas emissions. However, the impact of methane is greater than that of carbon dioxide. So it's superior in a sense as far as its global heat trapping capacity as a greenhouse gas. We use a measure called global warming potential, and that's based on CO2e or CO2 equivalent units. In the lifespan of carbon, which is on hundreds of years, methane has a GWP global warming potential of 30 times that of carbon dioxide. However, methane only lasts for about 7 to 12 years in the atmosphere before it's oxidized. And so it actually, over that span, a GWP of 20 actually is 85 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So it really is one of those gases that we need to pay a lot more attention to. So addressing methane emissions could prevent a nearly quarter of a degree Celsius of warming. And current warming is at about a 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade. So if you do the quick math on that, we could be saving upwards of a decade of warming potential if we were to address methane now.
I love all the numbers and facts you're giving us. What are the major components of methane emission, if it's such an immediate and a prioritized problem for us?
Yeah, so as far as methane goes, the primary sources are pretty well known. I think most people would be unsurprised to guess that at the top of the list is oil and gas. Methane is produced as a byproduct or even a primary product of oil and gas industry. But a lot of folks would be surprised to hear that on the agricultural side of things, especially in countries that have large beef and dairy operations, that those emissions are on par with oil and gas in those types of countries as well. The other major contributors, of course, are things like landfills and public works and utilities, like wastewater treatment and whatnot.
Okay. And that leads to your current work. You focus on the enteric methane sector. And where does it belong to?
Sure. Yeah. As far as enteric methane, very specifically, as you mentioned earlier, an intro is burps or eructations. That's a Scrabble word for you for burp. As far as that goes, the methane that's produced from cows predominantly is actually not produced from the rear of the cow, as most people think.
Mm-hmm.
That's only about 5 to 10% of it. The other 90 to 95% is enteric. And enteric methane is actually the methane that's produced by microbes in the cow's stomachs that help them to digest their food. A lot of us are aware that cows kind of chew their food a couple of times, and part of that process is actually the fermentation that goes on in their rumen. That's why they're called ruminants, and the rumen is the first of the 4 compartments. It's not a full chamber, but it's areas within the stomach, and it's the first one. So when cows are exhaling and when they're burping, that's when they're producing the enteric methane.
So there are many subsectors of methane, and within agriculture, there's the ones enteric methane we're talking about. What draw your attention to this space in the first place?
Sure. Well, it kind of goes back to my transition into climate tech in general. I was looking for opportunities, generally speaking, of making an impact. And within the enteric methane space, I saw, at least from an outsider's perspective, and I'm learning that this is somewhat true, but also somewhat more nuanced than I had originally thought, that there were polar opposites, folks that either thought you needed to just get rid of the cows to get rid of the methane, or that the folks that were producing, the producers, essentially didn't care about getting rid of the methane. The truth is, it's more nuanced and it's more centralized than that. But the idea that for me coming into this space was to try to help to facilitate solutions and conversations for folks to kind of move towards the middle a little bit more. My background, my family, they're from Saskatchewan. They're farm producer and farmer folks from the prairies up there in Canada. Myself personally, I'm a little bit more of a technologically based person. I've been a programmer for most of my life. I've also been a gardener as long as I can remember. But the reason I bring these points up is because there's, even with people with different perspectives, there's always middle ground where we can come together and we can find solutions that hopefully speak to both sides. So, for instance, from a producer side, they're very interested in ensuring that their productivity is not impacted, that they're continuing to produce at the same or adequate levels that they were before, because they're already operating on razor thin margins. They've had these operations for generations, and it's part of American culture, these farms and these dairy operations. So we don't want for them to have a harder lifestyle. But on the flip side, we see the impacts of methane emissions on our warming planet, and we need to do something about that as well. So finding those solutions in the middle is something that really is attractive to me, and I appreciate the challenge that it hasn't quite been 100% solved yet.
Sure. So between the two extreme polarized opinions, between no solutions needed or we get rid of cows, what are some solutions we figure out in between?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot out there that's going on in the space. It's actually really exciting, a lot more than I had originally even understood in my first explorations in the space. But generally speaking, there are interventions that can be done from a either a feed additive perspective. There's also vaccinations that people are looking into. We can even go, depending on your regionality, there are certain implementations that can be brought to bear that can improve the efficacy. For instance, in the global south, which is places like Asia, Africa, there are a lot of subsistence farmers, for instance, that have cows there, and they have a couple of cows, and these cows in some places act literally as bank accounts for them. If they have a bad harvest in a given year, they might sell a cows to offset that loss. Or if they have a great harvest, they might buy another cow so that they have more in the bank, so to say. Now, these cows aren't really being used effectively or efficiently because they're essentially bank accounts, and they sit there and they do what they need to do. However, those cows again are producing more methane per product unit, whether that be milk or
Yeah.
meat, than other cows. So this is a
Mhm.
place where we can use things like improving their feed. We can build out supply chains to collect the milk, for instance. But these are all potential solutions. Again, regionally, that might work in the global south. In the global north, I mentioned vaccines, feed additives. On the feed additive side of things, there's things like red seaweed, Asparagopsis taxiformis, that is kind of all the rage right now. There's a lot of interesting research being done on the efficacy there, and it's seeing potential gains between 20 to 30% in practice. But there are regulatory issues with that, and
Yeah.
potential human and animal impacts from a health perspective with some of the byproducts of that process as well. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the space, and really the solutions portion of this talk could be an entire talk in and of itself.
I love it. Between many solutions we mentioned, right? Increase the productivity, adding feed additives or vaccines. Let's dive into them to talk more in depth. And I think what I've heard mostly is about feed additives, especially the seaweed you were mentioning. Can you introduce us more about it?
Okay, so As far as feed additives, there are two main classes of feed additives. There's alternative hydrogen sinks, and then there's methanogenesis inhibitors. The alternative hydrogen sinks, you can think of it directly in the sense of CH4, the chemical composition of methane. There's 4 atoms of hydrogen to every 1 atom of carbon. Basically, that just means we want less of that hydrogen available to create methane. As far as the methanogenesis inhibitors, that is actually inhibiting those organisms that live within the rumen's microbiome from actually being there, whether that's removing them or reducing them or whatever else. So that's the kind of the 2 major categories. Now, as far as the types of solutions themselves, there are a couple of them. We talked about Asparagopsis taxiformis, the red seaweed. A lot of folks have heard about this. The active ingredient in that seems to be doing most of the impact on the methane emissions is called bromoform. So it's either the seaweed itself or synthetic bromoform is also being produced and tested. It is a methanogenesis inhibitor. It shows promise in tests in lab of upwards of 90% reduction in vitro. So that means, in a vial, essentially, not actually in real life, which is in vivo. In vivo, they've done studies, and we've really only seen it in beef feedlots, so not out on pasture, but where the cows come in and they finish them off. And in those beef feedlots, we've only seen about a 30 to 60% at best inhibition of methane. So there's promise there. The thing about it is, though, is that there are supply chain concerns with this product in particular because it is very volatile and it can be oxidized very easily. In fact, I was at a conference recently where a rancher had spoken of a $45,000 learning opportunity where they had harvested a bunch of the seaweed and they had lost the entire product because it oxidized very quickly and it lost its efficacy and chemical composition. So the solution there is putting it in oils and otherwise isolating it. But we're working through those steps. It's also not something that has been approved from a regulatory perspective. And honestly, none of these solutions have really truly been fully approved yet either. And so that's why we're kind of in a growing phase right now. But we want to be very careful because we don't want this to be another one of those RBST issue back in the 90s. We really need these products to be healthy and available for humans to have naturally. So that's the red seaweed side of things. There's a lot of promise there, but again, we want to make sure that it's safe for both animals and humans. We also have 3-NOP. That is the only one that has been approved by the FDA so far in any kind of capacity. And 3-NOP is 3-nitrooxypropanol. It is a product that it has a market name of Bovaer that was recently approved in May by the FDA for use on dairy farms only. Now, 3-NOP has about a 30% impact on methane emissions, so it's pretty impactful. The problem is that we have to feed it to the animals on a pretty regular basis. That works well in a dairy farm, but if we were to put it out in the pasture, there's really not a very good way of getting those animals to eat that feed on a regular basis. So we need to think of other ways of potentially implementing solutions there. Things like a bolus, which is a large pill that's inserted into the animal's stomach that slow releases over time. That might work. Things like putting it into water in their feed troughs, that might work as well. And so that is kind of a different part of this conversation as far as the implementation side of things. But other things as far as feed additives, lipids, for instance, can show a 10 to 20% reduction in methane emissions. Basically what that means, just incorporating high fat feeds into their diet so that these so that it causes less methane to be produced as well. Other not as effective but interesting areas that people are looking into, adding things like essential oils, even garlic has shown some promise. I think it's only about a 1 to 2% reduction, and it does have a side effect of garlicky milk for the milk perspective. So
no way.
That's one that probably won't be getting a wide stream adoption, but there's kind of the story here is that there's a lot of options from the feed additive perspective. And also it is kind of building the story that I'd like to kind of drive home, that this is going to be an area where we need additive solutions. It's not going to be a silver bullet type of solution where we have different solutions that are added up and used in combination to get us to more of that methane reduction that we're looking for.
Yeah, it seems that at the same time, it's a very promising solution. You know, some red seaweed or some pills can take out 30, 40 to even 90% of the impact. But with the regulation and then the impact of bringing lab experiments to real life, and also the implementation process can be really challenging. How
Yeah.
about the price? I guess all these innovations need someone to pay for them. Who is going to pay for this?
Yeah, actually, before we get into that, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the other solutions that are not feed additives.
Okay.
So other potential solutions that are not feed additives include just adding additional feed or higher quality feed, for instance. I mentioned that
Okay.
earlier. There was a study by USAID in Kenya that was back around 2019. And with those small holders, they saw increased milk production of upwards of 40% or more over that time, just based on the feed that was being provided to the animals. Now, that also translated to a emissions intensity reduction of 27%. And so
Okay.
it's not necessarily the total amount of emissions that are emitted, but the amount of intensity per unit of product, as mentioned earlier. So that's one method, improving the feed. Also improved animal husbandry, just overall, vaccinations, vet visits, health management, those types of things. Even geofence pasture patterns being put into place with cows that have wearable collars that will direct them to go to certain paddocks or certain areas of the pasture so that they're eating certain types of feed for certain amounts of time. So these are all options that potentially can help reduce either the intensity or the emissions themselves. And then another promising one, particularly from a low tech perspective, is just breeding and genetics. So if we do tests and phenotyping and genotyping on these animals and understand what types of traits they have that are potentially low methane type traits, but without impacting productivity, ideally, we can breed those animals into existing populations. Now, again, you're only seeing improvements of 1% to 2% over each generation of the cow, but it is a relatively low tech way of impacting the amount of methane that's being produced. And it's really going to be impactful, hopefully, in places like the global south, where those technological advances are maybe harder to get to. And again, we mentioned earlier, being able to implement these solutions with cows in the pasture or that aren't, they're not interacting with humans on a daily basis is going to be something that's really important. So mention those vaccines that's kind of being looked at as a potential silver bullet in a way. I don't know if we'll get there. We certainly are seeing that we think we can achieve at least 20
Mhm.
to 30% reduction with them. And the good thing about a vaccine is it only has to be applied maybe 1 or 2 times, hopefully, in the cow's life early on to impact the rumen microbiome for the lifespan of the animal. That would be great if we can do that. And then also some solutions using CRISPR, gene editing, and potentially changing the genes of those organisms that exist within the rumen and that microbiome so that they don't produce methane, or the organisms that do produce methane are less predominant. And then two other solutions that are out there, I'd say they're out there. You've got on-plant solutions, which are potentially, solutions that are either bred into the plant or applied to the plant matter that the cows are eating that cause them to produce less methane. And then wearables, which is actually something that I put in my original paper when I looked in this space. It's proving to maybe not be the best solution. What the wearable is it's something that goes over the cow's snout, and when they breathe out, it oxidizes the methane into carbon dioxide and water. The problems that we're seeing with it, though, is it does seem to impact the health and productivity of the animals. They
Okay.
oftentimes uh, are seen to be drooping or less active. And as far as their productivity, they've been found to potentially impact the amount of feed that they eat, which at the end of the day is going to increase the intensity of the methane that they produce, but also cause farmers to potentially have less bang for their buck, so to say, for those animals, either from a meat or dairy perspective.
Interesting, as so many solutions are still evolving, some of the originally seeming promising solutions now are deemed not yet. I wonder, as you're working in this field, which stage are you? Are you in the phase of researching for all potential solutions, or you're already implementing some with local farms?
So what we do at Spark is we help to identify solutions that are maybe underserved or less well known and don't have the financial backing that they need, and we help to connect folks, from the investment space and the public space and government space to those solutions to help those move forward. So we're not actually in the implementation business ourselves. What we do is we serve a service to help folks understand what the landscape looks like, and what solutions are out there, what solutions folks should go after potentially if they have particular, you know, desires from an investment philanthropical perspective, for instance. So yeah, as far as Spark goes, we're not implementing any of the solutions ourselves, but there are startups across the board. There are organizations across the board. There are universities that are doing a lot of the studies to validate some of these things. And again, some private companies are starting to pop up that are taking advantage of these things, from the Asparagopsis taxiformis, the red seaweed, to Bovaer. We mentioned that earlier. That's been developed by DSM Firmenich over in Germany, and it's being released or distributed here in the United States by Elanco. So there are different companies out there that are definitely moving into this space and making progress across each of these solutions.
Yeah, I guess that wraps me back to my previous question, right? There are so many solutions out there to, and once they are ready to apply in real life, who is going to pay for this innovation, this service, and who is
Yeah,
going to benefit from this process as well?
that's the eternal question: who's going to pay for it? For sure. So there are a lot of ways that this can potentially be paid for, and it's being done in different ways in different parts of the world with different regional perspectives on how this is going to be done. In Europe, they do have policy that is being implemented in a lot of places. For instance, in Denmark, they just introduced a tax on livestock animals for the emissions that they're going to be producing. It's going to be brought in kind of slowly. The idea there, I believe, is that the the Danes are hopeful that the tax will be more preventative in nature,
Mm,
and so that folks will want to address their enteric methane emissions directly prior to being taxed for them. The goal there is less punitive, hopefully, and more preventative. Over here in the United States, we have an entirely voluntary market. There are programs that have been that taxpayers are paying for in certain localities. California has fantastic programs, for instance, with their manure management programs, and they're looking to. They've almost reached their goals for the manure management methane emissions reductions. However, the enteric, as we mentioned earlier, the enteric side of things is a much larger portion of that. So they're looking to implement similar incentive type programs to hopefully reduce those emissions there as well. So taxpayers are helping to pay for it from an incentive perspective. Consumer product good companies, though, CPGs as well, big companies like Danone and Starbucks that use a lot of milk products, for instance, they want to offset their emissions, both from a business sustainability and social acceptance perspective, right? So they are looking for potentially creating insets or offsets to purchase some of those emissions away from the producers that are actually implementing solutions to reduce their methane emissions. So that's another potential option. And then as far as the research goes, that's going to be generally speaking from a public and philanthropic perspective. Those are the folks that are funding these efforts to figure out what the solutions are before they're implemented. And then there is just good old capitalism going on from a perspective of startups that are coming into the space and trying to find solutions predominantly that impact the methane emissions, but also do it
Mhm.
in a way that either improve or don't impact efficiency. As I mentioned earlier, from a producer perspective, they're already operating on razor thin margins. So from their perspective, they can't afford any productivity losses. So if you can convince somebody that, hey, we have a product that's actually going to improve your efficiency for what you're producing. Oh, and by the way, it's going to reduce methane. That's kind of the audience that you're looking for with that type of solution.
Awesome. So we've seen progress from the policy front, and the farmers potentially can receive enough incentive to do that, and then cooperatives and consumers could consume the end product of milk, and the cheese, so on and so forth, can also voluntarily at this moment contribute their share. But it seems that it's all going to the right direction. But are there any challenges we are facing currently?
Oh, certainly. I mean, it's a promising space, but it's certainly one that's unsolved. One other area of potential price solution, if you will, is just by consumers being willing to pay for sustainably produced goods. There was just a price survey that was released, I think, a couple months ago, but definitely in 2024, that said upwards of 80% of consumers would be willing to pay an almost 10% premium on products that were sustainably produced. So that's a potential avenue. And frankly, from a producer's perspective, that's the most straightforward one because they do have some skepticism of those incentives. Because if incentives can go away, we can just increase the value, the perceived value for these products that are more sustainably and more and less emissions produced, then that's another potential option as well. So as far as from problems perspective, some of the things that we're seeing again are getting these solutions on farms. We also have a rather lengthy regulatory process as far as getting these things approved in the United States. Sometimes it can take upwards of 8 years to get something approved. And so you could have a solution that you're sitting on that feels like it could be a potential silver bullet, if you will, that has to go through a number of studies, safety studies, and these are all good things. We need to do these things to ensure that we're not having issues where the public loses trust in the product itself, and or we do something that is not good for humans in general, right? So we do need to take those steps, but it is a hurdle that we need to get around. Again, from a producer perspective, we need to make it worth their while. And if we
Yeah.
don't have incentive programs and we don't have yet that price parity as far as, hey, I'm willing to pay more. And again, with inflation going on, we're all feeling it in our pocketbooks. That kind of goes by the wayside. Your goodwill towards the environment a little bit until we're able to get out of that. So, there's promises out there for the next for foreseeable years. I think we really will boil down to collaborations of piecing together solutions that work really regionally well for a particular area,
Mm.
and the constituents, taxpayers in particular, and producers in that area. California does have a really good model right now, as mentioned. I think that they're probably the leaders, at least in the U.S. space from a voluntary perspective, and then from a maybe more policy-based perspective, Europe has some interesting options on the table as well. But
Okay.
there's regional solutions across the board that all are worth talking about.
Sure. It's definitely a space that, with a lot of urgency, promise, but on the other side, with its own challenges. I wonder, given your experience working in the enteric methane space, what are some fun facts or like good moments you'd like to share?
Sure, yeah. A good one, and this is a great conversation starter for parties if you get into a science conversation about enteric methane, which we all do, of course. Cows can produce upwards of 40 gallons of saliva a day, depending on their diet. 40 gallons.
40 gallons. Whoa.
Gallons. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Also, in certain supply chains, cows are fed all kinds of food system byproducts, spent grains from brewing, almond hulls, orange rinds, all kinds of other produce that may go to waste. So, because of their ability to kind of pair up with that microbiome in their rumen, they're able to actually make product out of a lot of things that will otherwise go to waste and potentially produce methane just by decomposing as well. Cows also are huge fans of candy and anything that comes from bakeries that's waste there. So that's another byproduct thing that they love. And
Yeah.
then finally, I think it's important to note too that ruminants in general, cows, they can effectively graze because of that specialized stomach that they have. They can effectively graze on 50 to 60% of lands that are otherwise unsuitable for crop production. So they're
Mm,
not always just taking over land that would otherwise be used for food production. They're
yeah,
sometimes making food production in places where you wouldn't otherwise be able to do it. So that's something that we can use in our arsenal as we move forward with understanding land use management and what how we produce proteins in the world.
definitely. It's amazing how much more you get to know about cows being in the field. I guess are you considering having your own cow in your garden?
Oh wow, I would, Tammy, I'd love to have my own cow in my own garden. Where I live, that is not allowed. But as far as being a part of a cyclical government or sorry garden environment, yeah, they would be a really interesting part of that. And I certainly have chickens, and I love the way that they are integrated into my food waste from my home. They eat that, they produce eggs. I use their waste in my garden. Similarly, cows could be used to that effect as well. They have different efficiencies, of course, chickens and cows, but yeah, they are healthful animals. And another thing I want to hit on really quickly, especially in areas where proteins are generally hard to come by, they provide a quick and easy source of protein for folks, for instance, in the global south that need milk to grow, where there are things like food insecurities. We have to be careful that we don't say, hey, we're just going to remove the cows because
Yeah.
there are a lot of people that rely on that protein in those food insecure type environments. So yeah, there's a balance to be struck for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Echo on that. So thank you for your introduction on the methane. I guess now it's time to dive into career transition. Nowadays many people who are starting to contribute their skill set into climate space, me included, but you successfully landed your job and happily working in your current role. Tell us more if you have any advice for people in the process of transitioning.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. We actually both were part of the same cohort in a climate career accelerator. And I would say that that was probably really foundational and formational for me. When I decided to make this jump, I had kind of I wouldn't call it a midlife crisis, but I was halfway-ish through my career, and I wanted to be focused on something that I cared about doing, and not just doing it because I was good at doing it. And so that was kind of what brought me back to climate. I say back to climate because I actually have a degree, a bachelor's of science in meteorology from many, many years ago. So bringing me back to climate from the web and application development space. But yeah, being able to really just say, okay, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to focus on, and kind of approaching my career. I'm a former product and project manager, still project manager, of course, but product on the tech side of things. Approaching my career as a product and approaching myself as a product, and making sure that the values that I provide are transferable into this space. I think that was the number one thing that I learned from that accelerator that we both participated in, was
Yeah.
ensuring that you're providing value with the current values that you have while you upskill on those other values that you don't have. We just talked a lot about enteric methane, and maybe it sounded like I had a lot of great stats and I knew a lot of what I was talking about, but I'm just scratching the surface, and I've only been doing it for 6 months or so at best, right? And so there's so much more to learn. So while I'm learning all of that, how do I continue? How do I get a job in this space? How do I move myself forward? Well, I bring my organizational skills, my technological skills. I bring those to bear with solutions within Spark Climate that they can use to move their programs forward as I get up to speed on those more specific details within the space. So I would say, my one piece of advice is ensure that you're always providing value, that you're focused on that, when you're in any type of conversation. And that's actually what I'm doing right now with this conversation, is ensuring that my comment is valuable, hopefully, to other folks.
Absolutely. Learned a lot. Thank you, Barrett, for your sharing. And I think definitely Climate Drift is the program we're in, worth a shout out. And I think personally speaking, one of the biggest takeaway for me is to really produce content in the space you're interested in to develop your expertise meanwhile you're learning. And that is also how I got exposed that you like this field of enteric methane is because you published an article on it, did your research, and gradually developed into the space.
That's a prime example, Tammy. Thank you for bringing that up. Again, when I was moving into the space, I didn't know very much about methane, enteric methane in general, and so I did a deep dive into looking into enteric methane in particular. It caught some eyes. Those eyes in conversations where I provided my value and how I could help folks out ended up leading to my current gig as well. So yes, it all lines up one after the other.
Absolutely. Thank you, Barrett. I guess now it's time for us to go to the lightning round. First one, sustainability tips. Can you share one simple sustainability practice that you've incorporated into your daily life?
Oh, there's so many. I wish I had more than one, but I'll go with look out for single-use plastics. There's so many single-use plastics out there.
Mm.
I shop at Costco because I have a kid and a family, and we need to sometimes buy in bulk. But even when you're there, just look out for the single-use packages within other packages. For instance, that plastic is all waste that basically just goes straight into the landfill. And with that in mind, some of those single-use plastics can actually be reused. For instance, anything that has a Ziploc type of top on it, you can use those to potentially store more of that smelly garbage that you don't want stinking up your garbage. So now your garbage can lasts a little bit longer. So just be aware of single-use plastics and how you use them, and try to upcycle whenever possible.
Definitely. Okay, next topic would be book recommendation. What is one book you would recommend for our listener interested in climate and sustainability?
So it's not specifically a climate sustainability book. It's actually more of a product and user experience type of book, and it's called Switch: How to Change Things When Change is Hard. It's by Chip and Dan Heath, I believe. They're brothers, but the concept really boils down to understanding that we all know we have two sides of our brain, our left and our right, and really the idea is that when we're proposing ideas and we want people to buy into them, uh, changing user behavior is one of the most difficult things we can do. We're all we enjoy the things we enjoy, and we're used to routine. So when you want to break that up, you need to speak to both sides of the brain. You need to speak to the logic as well as the emotional sides of things. And that's where you truly find that people actually listen. So if it's about, heart disease, for instance, you may want to talk about the stats on it, and that's great, and that appeals to the left brain person. But the right brain person that's maybe more emotive maybe wants to hear about how an intervention saved someone's life, and those types of things. It's important to have both of those sides of the story to really drive something home, and that's really important when we're doing things like climate change, which not everyone buys into right away. So we need to make sure we're paying attention to our audience.
Yeah, definitely to develop that empathy to understand both parties.
Absolutely.
Solid. The next one would be, what is the best piece of advice you would give someone who is looking to transition into climate?
Uh, I think the best piece of advice, besides what we just talked about, is a quote that's been said by many people. I'm going to attribute it to Wayne Gretzky because I'm Canadian and I like hockey. But it's you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. And what I mean by that is, don't be afraid to push yourself out on a limb and try something new, and reach out to somebody, because that person isn't going to reach out to you randomly. So you might as well give it a shot and see what happens. And if it doesn't work out for you, move on. You learn from it, and you move on. But no one's coming to you to give you exactly what you want to achieve. So go out there and get it yourself.
Yeah, I'm currently on that phase myself. It's definitely a full-time job, but when you get a short hit, it's also a great feeling.
100%.
Yeah, I wish I can pass it onward to some other people later when I hit my best shot. Okay, next one is on technology. Can you name a technology or innovation that you believe would have a great potential for a positive environmental impact?
I think that this one might be a little bit controversial, but I actually am a huge proponent of AI in general, AI and ML. And I think that, the way I look at it, and for what it's worth, a full disclosure, I'm currently working on a master's in AI ML at the moment, so I'm somewhat biased, of course. But it's a technology to me that's on par with the steam engine transition from the horse. It's one of those things that's going to empower us to do more things and not less. And I think there's a lot of fear out there for it to potentially usurp a lot of the things that we do as humans. Those comfortable things we were talking about a moment ago, right? And it's possible that some of that will happen. However, with all of these technological transitions that have happened throughout the evolution of human history, each of them has given us an opportunity to become more creative and focus more on the things that we're good at, which is being creative, emotive, and thoughtful people. And I think that if we partner with AI and we embrace it, we'll be able to use it to its fullest of its abilities. If you don't, I think that, someone else might do that and take your job then. So I'm not sure. But I do think that AI and ML is something that can be used for good, especially if we use it empathetically and in what we're doing.
Yeah, as this podcast is everything about data, AI, and sustainability, I definitely I'm bullish on the AI's impact on sustainability. But we do need to manage well how we use it ethically and how to develop it sustainably.
Absolutely.
Great. Last question for you is your own personal sustainability goals. What is the one you set for yourself this year?
So for this year, my sustainability goal, as I mentioned, I'm already keeping an eye on single-use plastics, but my next one is to basically stop purchasing water that I can get out of my tap. So what I mean by that is, for instance, I've switched recently to chew paste, which is a solid form toothpaste that comes in little capsules. You put it in your mouth and you chew it.
Yeah.
Saliva is the water in that case, right? With detergents for your dishwashing or for your washing machine. You don't need to pay for the fluids because it's really the chemicals that you want from those products that do the job. So you use the water that you have on hand. And the reason that that's important is because water is, it's not light. I believe it's 8 pounds per gallon. And so we're paying for that from a carbon emissions perspective, CO2e emissions perspective across the board. Went from the moment it's produced to the moment that it's shipped to the time to your gas that you're buying and picking it up from the supermarket and bringing it back home. So if you've already got this water system in place, why not use what you have and reduce a little bit of your impact on the planet that way?
Yeah, I actually, in my previous experience in the incubator, that was one of my business ideas. I hope one day it becomes very mainstream and everyone can adapt the same habits.
Agreed. Yeah, I think it would be a great step overall for all of us to go in that direction.
Thank you so much for sharing, Barrett. Learned a lot about enteric methane. I think you already developed a good wealth of knowledge on this subject matter, and hopefully we can find some good solution soon.
Yeah, I think so. I think, as I mentioned, on the enteric methane space, it's going to be a combination of solutions across the board. And it's probably going to be regionally produced for different areas so that we really are effective in those solutions and that they're taken up by the constituents in those areas. And, I appreciate the note about my knowledge, but maybe you can have me back on in another 6 months and we'll see where I stand then and I can speak to it a little bit better.
Yeah, let's do that. There is always progress in the field, and maybe we'll talk about one specific solution, and we'll see some interesting applications already.
That sounds great.
Okay, thank you, Barrett.
Thank you so much for having me.